We'll get better sleep tonight. All right, guys, if you have a Bible with you this morning, Jonah chapter 1 is where we will be. Old Testament book of Jonah, chapter 1. And as you're turning there, I had the privilege of having a pretty good relationship with my dad most of my teenage years. Not everyone in this room can say that. I understand that. And increasingly, as I've gotten older, and so has my dad, I've remarked to him how grateful I am that we had this really good relationship growing up. After I got back from my summer retreat experience 25 years ago, one of the first things I did was I apologized to my dad for what a complete jerk I had been to him most of that summer. My dad's response was classic. He's like, "You're right, son. You were a jerk." I'm like, "Hey, I'm trying to apologize." He's like, "It's about time." But he noticed very quickly that God was doing some things in my heart. In fact, one of the things that I prayed about was joining the youth leadership team of my youth group. One of the things I had to do was get my dad to agree that my lifestyle was what it was being portrayed as. My dad was like, "Yeah, I've seen changes in my son's life." So I became a student leader. What that basically meant was I would show up early and then I would stay late to pick up, set up, clean up, do whatever was needed. But once a month we had these student leader meetings, and they were on a Sunday. Well, if you know anything about weekends, especially in Austin or Houston, weekends are the prime time for mowing the lawn. And my dad never mowed the lawn while I was a teenager. He let me do that, or should I say he told me to do that. And so he told me, "Son, you need to get up early and you need to mow the yard because it's going to rain today, so you need to get up at 6:30 and you need to be on the yard by 7. Yeah, whatever, old man. I did not wake up until about 9, get moving. My dad's like, "It's going to rain, it's going to rain." And sure enough, right as I get out to the garage to get the lawnmower out, boom, it rains, drenches the yard. I could not mow it. "Son, you didn't do what I told you to do." "Well, Dad, I just ran out of time." "Yeah, you ran out of time. You ran out of obedience." I was like, "It's just grass. No big deal, right? It'll grow just a little bit more. It's Houston. It's summer. It doesn't grow a lot anyway." The next day, I didn't have my license yet, and I went down the stairs, and I was like, "All right, Dad, I'm ready to go to my student leader meeting." He's like, "I lost my keys." "I lost my keys." I'm like, "Your keys are in your pocket." He's like, "I don't see them. Do you see them?" I'm like, "What kind of game are you playing with me, Spock? What's going on here?" And he goes, "Son, yesterday you chose to disobey me. Today, I'm choosing to disobey you." "But Dad, I'm a leader. They're counting on me." He goes, "Should have thought about that yesterday." Son, he taught me a lesson that actually Jonah will teach us today. Present actions will determine future consequences. In fact, if you don't get anything out of today's message but that's what I want you to get, is that present actions will determine, they almost dictate future consequences. Because I suspect that what we're going to run into is Jonah is going to disobey God, and in turn, God's going to disobey Jonah's desires. So let's dive in. We're gonna take a look at some of the text, and then we'll make some comments. We're going to look, and then we're going to talk. So we're going to go through that rhythm. So Jonah chapter 1, I'm going to read verses 1 through 3. I want you to follow along with me. I'll be reading from the ESV. You may have the NIV, and that's fine. There's very minor differences between them. So here we go. "Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, 'Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me.' But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went on board to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord." I want to pause right there. And listen, if you're shooting Jonah like a movie, no entryway into the book. It starts right away in action. The word of the Lord comes to Jonah. It's an abrupt start. There's no build-up. You're joining this action in progress. And notice this is not a suggestion. Hey, Jonah, if you have some time, maybe you should do this. Hey, Jonah, if you're not too busy, can you go down to Nineveh and talk to them about how bad they are and how great I am? Hey, Jonah, if you want to, this is an elective. It's not an essential. No, if you read, it says, the word of the Lord says, arise. Common in the Old Testament for God to take his commands and call them the word of the Lord. It was either a proclamation of judgment or a proclamation of hope. And God was seeking out Jonah. God's initiating here. God is the one who is pursuing rebels. And at first you think it's Nineveh, but in reality, by the end of this book, you're going to see the rebel was Jonah. So Jonah, whose name means peace and love, son of someone who is faithful or true or faithfully true, is now had the word of the Lord come to him. Arise, get up and go. Don't just stay where you are. You're going to go to Nineveh. You're under my direction, and my direction, Jonah, should end up in your doing what I tell you to do. Go to Nineveh, a specific place. It was called Great. In fact, 14 times in Jonah, Nineveh is called Great. It was a large city, a strategic city, a city where the world paid attention to it. Does that sound like any other city you may be familiar with? Like Austin? A great city. It was founded by a man named Nimrod, great name, okay? Genesis chapter 10, you don't have to turn there, just listen. From that land, Nimrod, went into Assyria and built Nineveh. Second, only to Babylon and big cities at the time. It's a great city. It is a large city. It was on the Tigris River. It's about 500 miles northeast of Israel. So this is no small journey. You need to call out against it. Their evil has come up before me. Another prophet named Nahum talks about Nineveh in Nahum chapter 3, verse 1. Woe to the bloody city, all full of lies and plunder. There's no end to the prey. This is not something, eyes on me, this is not something Jonah wanted to do. Has God ever told you to do something that was hard to do? Raise your hands if that's been true of you. Has God ever told you to do something that's just really hard to do, you're reluctant to do? Jonah knew what was happening because he knew that the nation of Israel was disobeying God, and he knew what God was going to do. God was going to use Nineveh and Assyria to bring Israel under discipline. He knew that if he was going to do what he was going to do, Nineveh would actually then be used by God to capture Israel and bring them under discipline so that they would turn back to God. Jonah knows God. I know what you're up to. I'm going to go there. I'm going to preach to them. They're going to repent, and they're going to use them to capture Israel, and we're going to have a bad time. So I'm not going to do what you told me to do. You've got to give it to Jonah at least this. He wasn't trying to be sneaky. He just said, nope, I'm not going to do it. In fact, instead of running to God, like we just sang about, he ran away from God. It says that he boards a ship in Joppa, which is now called Jaffa or Haffa, Israel. You can still see it today. And he was going to board the ship to go to a place called Tarshish. 3 times in the first 3 verses, he says he's going to Tarshish. He's going to Tarshish. Why repeat it so much? Because he wants to emphasize something. Tarshish is 2,000 to 2,500 miles away from Nineveh. He's not just going a little bit off the path. He's going the other way, right? Right? Now, we've all had some sort of coffee this morning, so if you have, it's okay to... So, see, he's not just diverting a little bit. He's going the opposite way, right? Right. We'll get there. We'll get there. He's telling God, God, leave me alone. I'm running away from you. I'm running away from you. It's funny because you and I think that we can run away from God. But the more you run away from God, here's what you're going to find out, everyone. You're just going to run right to him. One of the verses we read this morning for quiet time is Psalm 139. Verse 7, where shall I go from your spirit, or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. Have you ever felt like God was just kind of hounding you relentlessly? If you've ever felt that way, let me tell you what's happening. He is. He is, and He will. And you will be thankful for that. At the time, it may not seem like you really want God to be all that in your business, but eventually you'll be able to be very grateful for that. And Jonah is not just an individual, he's actually representing God's people, Israel, at the time. They were being very disobedient, and God was ready to discipline them. There's always an easy out in disobeying God. It may not be a ship heading to a place called Tarshish, but it could be anything. It could be anything. All right, so here's where we are in the story. God tells Jonah to do something very specific. Jonah decides not to do it and say no, and he's going to go the other way. So let's jump back into Jonah chapter 1. We'll pick it up in verse 4. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God. And they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down in the innermost part of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. Okay, so just like Jonah is disobedient to God, now God's going to be disobedient to Jonah. Jonah throws a wrench into God's plan. God throws a storm in Jonah's way. Advantage, God, right? What's the best you can do? You can run with your feet. Boom! There you go. Lightning, thunder, rain, I win. That's what God says. True? And now think about this. The mariners, the sailors, they're afraid. Now I want you to know something. Sailors are trained not to be afraid. They're trained not to sweat storms. Storms are a part of sailing. I went on a cruise last year. It was a multi-ton boat with 4,000 people on it. This was a fortress in water, okay? All these people were on the boat, and this boat weighs a lot, and yet the water would make the boat ripple, and you'd see people like, oh, goodness. All the crew, they're like, whatever. I've been through worse. These guys, the storm is so big, so powerful, so quick, so fast that they react how? The mariners, the Bible says, were what? Afraid. Afraid. When you have seasoned, hardened sailors who have been through a lot of storms, when they react with, when they react like that, you pay attention, do you not? When the sailors get as white as Casper the Friendly Ghost, maybe it's time for you to go, dear Lord, right? And then they do something else. The ship is threatening to break up. In other words, the ship is threatening to literally disintegrate. So what they do to make sure that they can kind of take what the storm is giving them is they do something very, very costly to them. They take cargo. What do? Throw it overboard. Take cargo, and they're just chunking cargo. By the way, that cargo was money. The cargo was a money. They would sell that and make money. What are they doing? They're throwing their salary overboard. There goes Joe's salary. There goes John's salary. There goes my salary, right? That's what's happening. So the whole time they're doing this, and then they even get a little bit better. They start all calling out to their gods. They're calling out to this God. They're calling out to that God. Whatever God is going to work. They're using God as a commodity. In other words, I'm just going to call out to you so you do what I want you to do because really I just want you to do this thing. I really don't want to love you as a God. I just want you to do something for me. Now, all the time, where's Jonah? Sleeping. He's down in the bottom of the boat, and the Hebrew there is that he's in a very deep sleep. How sleepy do you have to be to sleep through a massive storm like this? Verse 6. So the captain came and said to him, "What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish." And they said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots so that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us. So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. The captain finds him. Hey, sleepy, wake up. Go and talk to your God. Perhaps your God will give a care about us. I want everyone to be calling out to their God. All these guys are crying out to all these false gods. Hey, call out to your God. None of ours was worked, so maybe yours will. Interesting that the captain and the sailors are more concerned about life and about living than who? Who? Jonah. Interesting that these guys who are not following God are actually more concerned about life than Jonah. Imagine that a pagan captain calls the prophet of God to prayer. Yesterday we talked about satire and about irony. Huge amounts of irony in that statement. Imagine a pagan captain does not believe in the God of Jonah, our God, does not believe in the one true God. And he's like, I'm calling you prophet of God, spokesperson for God, person who knows God. I'm calling on you to start praying. That is irony. And the captain calls Jonah to pray. God's going to use anything and anyone to get us where he wants us. Anything and anyone. Perhaps God will give us a thought. Literally what that means is perhaps God's face would begin to shine through these clouds. God maybe will give us a thought. But then they start getting impatient, so they do something back in that time called casting lots. Basically, if you want to know what casting lots is, imagine playing a game with dice. How many of you ever rolled dice before? Rolled dice? Okay. And they basically, in essence, they roll the dice, and the dice falls to, not you, okay, but I'm just pretending, all right? Jonah. And Jonah's like, seriously? God, did you? And God's like, yep, I sure did. I made the dice roll. And they're like, it's your fault. This is all your fault, you prophet. What are you doing? The lot falls on Jonah. Now, wait a minute. Are they gambling? No. They're doing everything they can to make sure and see what is happening, and God is even controlling the dice to roll right to Jonah. At this point, Jonah's in a little bit of trouble. Let's jump back in, starting in verse 8 through verse 11. Then they said to him, tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation, and where do you come from? What is your country, and of what people are you? And he said to them, I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. Then the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, what is this that you have done? For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord because he had told them. Then they said to him, what shall we do with you that the sea may quiet down for us? For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. So he's being peppered with questions. Whose account of this evil has come upon us? Interesting that sailors are attributing the activity of God as good or evil. Which one? Evil. Wait, Jason, I thought God isn't evil. He's not. So this means that what they're saying about God's work is not entirely correct. But at the time, does the storm seem like it's a good thing or an evil thing? Evil. On whose account did this come upon us? You see the actions of Jonah having consequences on who? Sailors in the ship. They've already lost money. They're thinking about losing their lives. So what do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? What people are you? And he answers, I'm a Hebrew. I fear God who made the sea and the dry land, a.k.a. the storm that you're currently in. Yeah, that's on my God. This is the God who sends a storm. Jonah, I find it interesting, is claiming allegiance to a God, look at me, that he wasn't even worshiping at the time. Who are you? I'm one of God's children. You're not acting like it. No, I'm not. No, I'm not. "What is this that you have done?" They grew exceedingly afraid. And then they asked them really more of an exclamation than a question. "What shall we do to you that the sea may quiet down for us? For the sea had grown more and more tempestuous." So this entire time, eyes on me for just a minute, the entire time this conversation is happening, the storm is not relenting. The storm is getting stronger. It is increasing. How many of you have ever had to drive through rain? Raise your hand. Not fun. And, a little pitter-patter here, it's okay. Turn the windshield wipers on and off, you're good. Then it starts raining a little bit more, and you're like, okay, the easy wipe, right? And then it starts really coming down, and you think there could have been a cat coming down, dogs and cats, and you start doing the wiper thing, and there is no, after this, you start praying at that point, right? This is what's happening to Jonah, except for he doesn't have windshield wipers. Storm is just growing tempestuous. They've already lost their cargo. They're in danger of losing their ship, and they could lose their very, very lives. They are angry, and his actions are costing them. They understood the severity of him running from God more than he did. Here's irony. You have a bunch of non-believers actually realizing the effects of Jonah's sin before Jonah does. Before Jonah. This isn't getting better. Things are about to get very, very bad unless something happens. And this is why Jonah has this written the way it is. He's driving us to this point, the big kind of climax of this story. So let's jump back in verse 12. And he said to them, "Pick me up and hurl me into the sea, then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you." Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. Therefore they called out to the Lord, "O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it has pleased you." Verse 15. So they picked up Jonah, and they hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Verse 16. Then the men feared the Lord, exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. What are we supposed to do to get this storm to stop? Jonah's like, "I need you to do the unthinkable so that you can get the unattainable. Throw me overboard." Dude, we're not going to throw you overboard. Throw me overboard. I want to throw you overboard, but I know I shouldn't throw you overboard, so I'm not going to throw you overboard. Throw me overboard. No, instead, what we're going to do, we're just going to row harder. And your laughter is profound. You know, come on, push. It's not going to get any easier. In fact, it gets worse. Interesting that this is a kind of a little bit of a snapshot into how people try to earn favor with God. What do I mean by this? Okay, so instead of doing what they know they should do, which is throw the guy overboard, and Jonah being a picture of Christ, one sacrificing for many, right? They decide to try and work their way out of this storm. And what happens? Doesn't work. So many people try to work their way into God's good grace. They just say, you know what? I'll just go to church more. I'll just read my Bible more. I'll just go to retreat. I'll wake up on time. I'll even eat all my meals, even though I don't like them. I'll even do everything I'm supposed to do. But the problem is that you can work, and that does not earn any grace for you whatsoever. It doesn't. God says, you cannot work long enough, hard enough, good enough to get back into my good grace. You need something else. Jonah is telling them, guys, you got to throw me overboard. You got to throw me overboard. We can't do that, dude. You'll lose your life. You got to throw me overboard. It'll get better. It's on me, and I realize this. And you have to think that Jonah's like, and then I would drown, which means I won't have to go to Nineveh for sure. Double score, right? By the way, that is kind of what Jonah's thinking. No, we can't. They're actually taking life more seriously than Jonah, which is interesting considering that these guys were sailors, which back in the time they were mostly pirates, arg, right? These guys were not the most upstanding moral men of the day. And yet they are taking life more seriously than God's chosen person. They call out to God, all other options are gone, and they have a quicker response time to obey than Jonah, so they throw him in. They throw Jonah overboard. And what happens? Immediately, the sea stops. The storm stops, the sea calm. Imagine being on this ship, the perfect storm, boom, boom, boom. For once, everything was, oh my gosh, whoa. And their response is the right one. They feared God exceedingly. Wouldn't you be a little bit afraid if all of a sudden God's chosen guy goes overboard and then whoop, calm as can be? All those other gods we were crying out to, yeah, those guys are silly. No, he's the one. And they feared the Lord, and they showed this by offering a sacrifice and making vows. They're afraid. They're obedient. They actually trembled in his presence. Now, some people would ask, well, did it stick? Was it just one of those, thank you, God, for getting us out of this pickle, but we're going to do what we want to do? We're not sure, but here's what you can say with some assuredness, that for this time, pagan sailors were more obedient to God than God's chosen man was. Present actions determine future consequences. And oh, if I could interview Jonah. If I could interview Jonah. If I could sit next to Jonah and have whatever recording device you have now, no more cassette tapes for me, right? If I could ask Jonah, I would just Jonah, let me ask you a question. If you knew the cost you would pay, would you have obeyed without a long delay time? Jonah, if you knew the cost that you could have paid, would you have actually just gone on and obeyed what God had to say without a lot of delay? I would have asked him that. Because this is what fascinates me about Jonah. He knew what he was supposed to do. He was the son of people who told truth and were faithful, yet he doesn't act faithful. And his actions had consequences. But where Jonah got it wrong, Jesus got it right. I want you to imagine living your entire life knowing that you're heading towards a cross. Eyes here. Eyes here. Imagine your entire life knowing the cross is coming, knowing that you will endure the cross. And it's the physical punishment of the cross is one thing, but bearing the weight of the wrath of God, the right anger God has over sin. Why is God so angry about sin? If you were God, you would be angry too. Why can't God just get over it? Because he's holy. He's perfect. Imagine, if you will, for just a minute. Just imagine this. Imagine that in line today for lunch, that I walk up to you and I just decide that I'm going to cut. Okay? Well, you're like, okay, that's the speaker. He needs to eat. He's old. That's fine. Yeah, that's cool. And then before I get my lunch, I just turn to you and I just slap the lips off your face. Did I fall asleep during your morning talk? No. Okay. And then you pick yourself up off the floor and you're like, okay. And then I just go in the other side and you're just like, and then you're a little bit angry. Maybe a lot of bit angry. In fact, you're like, I want to crush the speaker. I want to crush him. Like, I want him to lie down and I run over him and then reverse and then run over again. That's what you want to do. And then I walk up to you and say, well, what's the big deal? I thought you were loved. Can't you get over it? No, you've wronged me. And if you have the right to feel that way, which, by the way, you do, so I'm not going to slap anyone, how much more of a right does God have to that, since he's perfect and holy and has made all of us? Jesus is facing the weight of God's wrath. And in Luke 22, he says, if there's any other way that this can be done, can we do that? And then look at what Jesus does. He goes, nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. Where Jonah says, no, not your will, God, but my will be done. Jesus says, not my will, but your will be done. And Jesus endures the cross. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2 says, we're to fix our eyes upon Jesus, the author and finisher, perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him, the cross does not seem or sound like joy, but the joy of what the cross would do, he endured the cross and he scorned its shame and now sitting at the right hand of the Father. So where Jonah got it wrong, Jesus gets it right. And because of Jesus, even the times where we disobey God, we can now get forgiveness. We can now be restored in our relationship to God. Present actions will determine future consequences. Present actions will determine future consequences. And your present actions are directed by a very determined heart. Look at me. The way you believe will affect the way you behave. It always has and it always will. If you believe that doing this will give you the best action, the best pleasure, the best this, the best that, you're going to engage in that. If you believe that Jesus is truly better than all things, you will act accordingly. If you don't believe Jesus is better than all things, you will act accordingly. If present actions determine future consequences, present actions are directed by the direction of your heart. Where's your heart? Where's your heart right now? What I'd like you to do right now is just to bow your heads and close your eyes. I'm going to ask the band to come up and we're going to sing a couple of songs in response. But as they're coming up, with your heads bowed and your eyes closed, I want to ask you some questions to think about. God has called you to himself. He's called you to himself. God has reached out to you with love, and he's shown that love through the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. To think that God would send a storm to discipline us, that's one thing. But that God's love is seen through the storm is something quite else. Let me ask you to think about a time where God has disobeyed you when you've disobeyed him. And that God disobeying you was not anger, but love. Where's your heart today? Where is it right now? Are you running to this God? Are you trying to run from this God? Lord, I just come and ask that we would realize we can't run from you. No matter where we go, no matter what we do, we're not going to run from you. Whether it's Jonah in Jonah chapter 1 or whether it's the psalmist in Psalm 139, our feet aren't fast enough to outrun you. So Lord, instead of trying to run from you, Lord, may we run to you. Oh God, I pray this for our good. Pray this for your glory. Which in Jesus' precious and beautiful name I pray, and everyone said, amen.